Lucius Annaeus Seneca, known today as Seneca the Younger, was born around 4 BCE in the Roman province of Hispania, in the city of Córdoba, modern-day Córdoba, Spain. This provincial origin, distant from the epicenter of Roman political power, had a formative impact on his identity. While Rome remained the beacon of civilization and authority, Córdoba was a vibrant provincial capital rich in culture and intellect, offering Seneca a unique blend of Roman discipline and local philosophical curiosity from an early age. Seneca was born into a family of wealth and prominence. His father, Seneca the Elder, was an accomplished rhetorician and writer who authored important treatises on oratory that remain valuable historical sources. Through him, Seneca was immersed in the traditions of rhetoric, debate, and literary expression. This environment cultivated not only a mastery of language, but a deep reverence for intellectual engagement, shaping the younger Seneca's commitment to philosophical inquiry. From a young age, Seneca was exposed to the tension between action and contemplation, a theme that would later permeate his philosophical works. While his father represented the practical world of Roman civic life, his early exposure to philosophy opened the door to the more introspective discipline of Stoicism. This duality between public duty and personal virtue would become a recurring motif throughout his life. His early education in Hispania was rigorous, emphasizing grammar, rhetoric, and moral instruction, consistent with a Roman educational ideal. Yet, Seneca's appetite for knowledge soon surpassed what the provinces could offer. Around his adolescence, he was sent to Rome to continue his studies, a common practice among elite Roman families who sought to prepare their sons for public life. This move marked the beginning of Seneca's lifelong engagement with philosophy and the complexities of imperial politics. In Rome, Seneca came under the influence of several important philosophical teachers, most notably Attalus, a Stoic philosopher. Under Attalus's mentorship, Seneca developed a fascination with Stoic ethics, particularly its emphasis on virtue, self-control, and rationality. Although young and ambitious, Seneca was already drawn to the idea that true happiness could only be attained through the mastery of one's passions and a life lived in accordance with nature. It is crucial to note that Seneca's philosophical pursuits did not emerge in a vacuum. Rome during the early 1st century CE was a hotbed of intellectual ferment, where various philosophical schools, Stoic, Epicurean, Cynic, and others, vied for influence among the educated elite. The Stoics, in particular, held a certain appeal for Roman aristocrats who grappled with the ethical contradictions of wielding power in a morally ambiguous empire. Seneca's alignment with Stoicism thus represented both a personal conviction and a response to his socio-political context. Seneca's formative years also coincided with the rule of Augustus and, later, Tiberius, emperors who symbolized the consolidation of autocratic power in Rome. The shadow of this transformation cast itself over all aspects of Roman life, including the intellectual realm. As Seneca matured, he became increasingly aware of the precarious balance between philosophical integrity and political survival. Even in his youth, the dangers of outspoken critique in an authoritarian regime were apparent. Despite the relative distance of Hispania from Rome, Seneca never shed the mark of the provinces. This geographical and cultural origin, often downplayed in classical biographies, gave him a certain outsider's perspective that may have fueled both his philosophical detachment and his sense of civic duty. He carried with him a heightened awareness of the fragility of fortune, a Stoic ideal that would later animate his reflections on exile, power, and mortality. Seneca's early years laid the foundation not only for his intellectual evolution, but also for the personal contradictions he would grapple with for the rest of his life. He was born into privilege, educated among elites, and deeply immersed in a tradition that valued both material success and ethical austerity. This tension between Roman pragmatism and Stoic idealism would shape his choices, his writings, and ultimately his legacy. Rome, in the first decades of the Common Era, pulsed with intensity. Its streets were a mosaic of languages and customs, its forums alive with public discourse and legal oratory. Into this vibrant, sometimes chaotic city came the young Lucius Annaeus Seneca, a provincial by birth but not in ambition. With sharp features, an intense gaze, and a lean frame weakened by early health struggles, he stood out not only for his foreign origin, but for his intellectual hunger. He had not arrived merely to see Rome. He had come to understand it, to master it, and, in time, to speak to its soul. The education of an aristocratic Roman youth was a carefully curated ascent through rhetoric, literature, and philosophy, disciplines designed to produce men capable of influencing the Senate or leading armies. For Seneca, the curriculum was more than preparation for civic duty. It was a means of confronting the deeper questions of human existence. His studies in grammar and rhetoric began formally under masters whose voices echoed the traditions of Cicero and Cato, but he was soon drawn to subjects that questioned the very foundation of power, desire, and control. Among the teachers who left a mark on him was the Stoic philosopher Attalus. Attalus was not a man of compromise. He spoke of moral discipline with a sharpness that could pierce vanity and a clarity that could quiet confusion. To Seneca, this was not dry doctrine, it was revelation. He would sit for hours, not merely listening but absorbing, as Attalus urged his students to live not according to wealth or pleasure, but according to nature and reason. The philosopher's lessons were laced with contempt for luxury and emotional excess, ideas that planted themselves deeply in Seneca's mind. In parallel to his philosophical studies, Seneca immersed himself in the art of rhetoric. He listened to orators perform in packed basilicas and law courts, watched how language could move the masses or dismantle an opponent. He did not aim for theatricality, preferring the tight coil of logical argument to the flamboyant style favored by some contemporaries. His own speeches, delivered during training sessions and early court appearances, were noted for their precision and moral undertone. It became clear early on, Seneca did not speak to dazzle. He spoke to provoke thought. As his intellectual world expanded, so did his sense of personal identity. Rome offered grandeur, but also disillusionment. Behind the grandeur of temples and triumphal arches, Seneca saw corruption, vanity, and moral decay. This dual perception sharpened his philosophical lens. He began to question not only how to live within Rome, but how to live well in spite of it. He frequented the libraries and gardens where debates flowed freely and arguments clashed like swords, but always returned to his core interest: how to remain untouched by fortune, power, or fear. Not all of Seneca's influences were Stoic. He also explored Pythagorean doctrines, which emphasized asceticism and spiritual purity, and dabbled in Platonic thought. Though his allegiance remained with Stoicism, his mind was anything but dogmatic. He was eclectic, open to insights that could serve his lifelong mission: moral clarity. His philosophical notebooks, started in these formative years, were filled with fragments, maxims, and questions, some of which would resurface decades later in his mature writings. Seneca also took note of Rome's diverse population and the complex dynamics of empire. In the marketplaces, he heard the dialects of Gauls, Greeks, Syrians, and Egyptians. He observed the lives of freedmen and slaves, citizens and senators. This diversity impressed upon him the universality of human suffering and a shared need for ethical principles that transcended social status. For a Stoic who believed virtue was available to all rational beings, this was a profound realization. It seeded in him a belief that philosophy should be for everyone, not just the elite. His personal habits during this period were disciplined but not austere. He rose early, read voraciously, and practiced self-reflection. Though born into a wealthy family, he began experimenting with voluntary discomfort, a practice encouraged by Stoic teachers. He would sleep on the floor, eat plain food, or go without luxuries for periods of time, training himself to be indifferent to comfort. These acts were not dramatic gestures, but rehearsals for the trials of life, which he believed could come at any moment. Illness visited him frequently, threatening to derail his education. His lungs were weak, and there were periods when he could scarcely speak, let alone debate. Yet these moments of vulnerability only reinforced his belief in inner fortitude. Physical frailty became, paradoxically, a teacher. As he lay in bed, battling fevers and coughing fits, he contemplated the transience of life and the importance of preparing the soul for adversity. He was, even then, forging the inner armor that would define his later Stoic identity. The rhythm of Rome was relentless, and for a man like Seneca, driven, sharp, and increasingly visible in public life, it became difficult to stay in the background. As he matured into one of the most promising intellectuals of his generation, his presence was no longer confined to lecture halls and rhetorical exercises. He began to attract attention in the Senate, offering speeches that were not only technically precise, but often charged with subtle moral critique. In an age when emperors were gods and dissent could be treason, such brilliance was a double-edged sword. It was during the reign of Emperor Caligula that Seneca's rising fame first placed him in danger. Caligula, unpredictable and increasingly hostile to anyone who garnered praise or admiration, reportedly grew envious of Seneca's oratorical talents. According to later sources, Seneca's life hung in the balance when Caligula considered executing him for outshining others in the Senate. His survival was attributed not to favor, but to frailty. Caligula allegedly believed he would soon die of natural causes. It was a bitter irony. Seneca's chronic illness, a source of physical torment, also served as a shield. This brush with death did not silence Seneca, but it did alter his trajectory. He withdrew from the spotlight and devoted more time to philosophical contemplation. Yet this retreat was short-lived. In 41 CE, following Caligula's assassination, the new emperor Claudius came to power. Soon after, Seneca found himself entangled in scandal, accused of adultery with Julia Livilla, the sister of Caligula and niece of Claudius. The political undertones were unmistakable. Julia was a threat to the new regime, and Seneca, whether guilty or not, was collateral damage. Claudius ordered Seneca into exile on the remote island of Corsica. The journey to exile marked a dramatic shift in Seneca's life. He had gone from the opulent intellectual salons of Rome to a rocky, windswept island far from the empire's center. Corsica, harsh and sparsely inhabited, offered none of the comforts or prestige of the capital. It was a place of punishment, not reflection, or so it was intended. For Seneca, it became something else entirely, a sanctuary for the soul. Life in Corsica was not easy. The island's terrain was rugged, and its isolation was profound. Seneca was cut off from family, friends, and influence. But rather than succumb to despair, he turned inward. His letters from this period show a man wrestling with misfortune, not lamenting it. He began to see exile not as ruin, but as a test, a crucible through which his Stoic convictions would be forged. He wrote extensively, using solitude as a tool of philosophical refinement. In his treatises from exile, one can hear the evolving tone of a man learning to align theory with experience. His earlier philosophical interests had been largely academic. Now they became personal. He wrote about the futility of fame, the impermanence of fortune, and the power of the rational mind to endure suffering. In letters addressed to friends and fictional correspondents, Seneca began to articulate the themes that would define his legacy: the supremacy of virtue, the transience of external circumstances, and the necessity of inner freedom. Corsica taught Seneca humility and patience. It also taught him how to live with silence, both the silence of distance from Rome and the silence of being forgotten. Many of his former allies distanced themselves, fearing imperial suspicion. He had little contact with his family, and yet, even in this social death, he found vitality. His voice, though muted in political circles, grew louder in the realm of ideas. He was no longer a senator or court speaker. He was becoming a philosopher in the fullest sense. In time, he began to correspond with those still within Rome's orbit. His reputation as a man of letters slowly re-emerged. Some saw him as a tragic figure, wrongly punished. Others saw him as dangerous. But among the powerful was one who took particular interest in his intellect. Agrippina the Younger, the ambitious mother of the future Emperor Nero. She, unlike Claudius, saw Seneca not as a threat, but as an asset. Years after his exile began, it would be her influence that brought him back from isolation. Yet before that redemption, Seneca had to endure the full weight of rejection. He lived for nearly 8 years in exile, during which his health fluctuated and his prospects seemed dim. Despite this, he did not succumb to bitterness. He maintained a rigorous schedule of writing, study, and self-discipline. He walked daily in nature, observed the stars, and meditated on death. These were not mere diversions, but practices aligned with Stoic teachings, methods for strengthening the will and clarifying the soul. When the summons from Rome finally came in 49 CE, it did not mark a return to the old Seneca, but the emergence of a new one who had stared into the void and returned not broken, but composed. The winds of change often swept swiftly through the corridors of Roman power, and in 49 CE, they carried with them an unexpected turn in Seneca's fate. After nearly 8 years on the rocky island of Corsica, Seneca received imperial notice. His exile had come to an end. The command bore the signature of Agrippina the Younger, now the wife of Emperor Claudius and mother of a young boy destined for greatness, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, soon to be known as Nero. Seneca's recall was not a gesture of forgiveness. It was a calculated political move. Agrippina was a formidable figure. Astute, ambitious, and descended from the Julio-Claudian dynasty, she understood the power of optics and influence. She sought to consolidate her son's position as heir to the throne, and for that, she needed someone capable of molding him into a prince the Roman elite could respect. Seneca, with his reputation for wisdom, moral authority, and rhetorical brilliance, was the ideal candidate. More than a tutor, she needed a statesman cloaked in virtue who could lend legitimacy to her designs. When Seneca returned to Rome, the city had changed, but so had he. The chaos and decadence that pulsed through its marble streets no longer dazzled him. He walked the capital not as a man seeking favor, but as one whose years of isolation had carved away vanity. Yet he quickly understood the delicacy of the role he was being asked to play. To be a tutor to a future emperor was not merely to instruct, it was to shape, to guide, and perhaps to restrain. It was a responsibility fraught with risk. The boy Nero was only 11 when Seneca assumed his tutorship. He was intelligent, impressionable, and surrounded by danger. Court life was a battleground of whispers and ambition, and Agrippina, despite her cunning, was under constant threat from rival factions. Seneca approached his task with a clarity shaped by Stoic ideals, but tempered by political realism. He tailored his lessons not just to philosophy, but to the art of rule, justice, clemency, and restraint. He tried to teach Nero that the highest form of power was control over oneself. As Nero matured, so too did Seneca's influence grow. He was appointed praetor shortly after his return and later became part of the inner circle of the imperial court. When Claudius died in 54 CE, under circumstances many suspected to be engineered by Agrippina, Nero ascended the throne at the age of 16. Seneca, along with the military commander Burrus, became one of the 2 chief advisors to the young emperor. For a brief moment, it seemed philosophy had entered the palace. The early years of Nero's reign were marked by a surprising moderation. Policies were tempered, public works were undertaken, and justice was administered with unusual care. Seneca was widely credited with shaping this golden beginning, known to some historians as the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years of Nero. Seneca's speeches, composed for Nero and delivered in the Senate, struck tones of clemency, humility, and responsibility. They were rhetorical masterpieces, blending the language of empire with the spirit of philosophy. But behind the scenes, the tension was mounting. Seneca found himself navigating a court riddled with intrigue. Agrippina, once the architect of Nero's rise, began to lose influence as her son sought independence. Power shifted constantly, and the philosopher who once wielded influence through virtue now had to maneuver through shadows and shifting allegiances. Seneca attempted to maintain his integrity, but he was no longer writing in solitude. He was surviving in a den of lions. His proximity to power forced Seneca into compromises that weighed heavily on his conscience. He supported decisions he privately disapproved of, distanced himself from allies when necessary, and grew increasingly entangled in the moral contradictions of court life. He began to accumulate wealth and estates, perhaps as a means of securing influence, perhaps as a safeguard for a future retreat. Critics saw hypocrisy. Seneca, inwardly, saw struggle, a Stoic forced to walk a tightrope between philosophy and politics. Despite these complexities, he continued to write, producing some of his most refined works during this time. But unlike the letters of exile, his court writings were laced with caution. They offered guidance to rulers and reflections on power, death, and virtue, but always with a veil, measured, elegant, indirect. He knew that each sentence could be read as a critique, and each critique could be interpreted as treason. The philosopher was still present, but he now wore a mask. As Nero grew bolder, darker traits began to emerge: cruelty, narcissism, and paranoia. Seneca could not have been blind to this shift. He had taught the young emperor restraint, but the lessons were increasingly ignored. The early years of Nero's reign had promised harmony between wisdom and power, but court life was a volatile sea, and Seneca, though steady, was no sailor immune to storms. As the emperor's personal advisor, he was thrust deeper into the heart of imperial Rome, into a palace buzzing with whispers, fragile alliances, and the ever-present scent of betrayal. Every gesture carried meaning. Every silence was watched. Seneca, once a contemplative voice in solitude, now spoke through carefully measured actions, navigating a web where philosophy alone could not dictate the steps. Seneca had never sought power for its own sake, but in guiding Nero, he had become one of the most influential men in the empire. His days were filled with consultations, policy drafting, and speechwriting. He composed proclamations that praised moderation, counseled clemency, and evoked the image of an enlightened ruler, a mirror Nero was meant to see himself in. The philosopher, now a statesman, poured Stoic ideals into the machinery of empire, trying to shape a ruler through the quiet force of reason. But power, even when worn with restraint, can leave stains. Seneca found himself approving administrative decisions that, while politically prudent, chipped away at his philosophical purity. He sanctioned military actions that clashed with the Stoic preference for peace and wealth redistribution programs designed more to maintain public favor than to uphold any deeper ethical principle. His justifications became increasingly pragmatic, echoing a man attempting to reconcile virtue with reality, a balance as fragile as glass. Behind palace walls, Nero's transformation grew increasingly apparent. The young emperor, once shy and eager to please, began to indulge in spectacle and flattery. He pursued artistic fame, participating in theatrical performances and musical competitions, behavior scandalous for a Roman ruler. Seneca, disapproving in private, tried to redirect his protégé's passions toward nobler aims. He offered literary pursuits as an outlet, encouraged Nero to study philosophy, and praised simplicity in governance. But the young emperor's appetite for adoration had already taken root. Tensions rose as Nero clashed with his mother, Agrippina. Their power struggle turned brutal, culminating in the orchestrated assassination of Agrippina herself. Though Seneca was not directly implicated, his silence was deafening. Some accounts suggest he tried to dissuade Nero. Others hint that he advised caution rather than resistance. Regardless, the event marked a rupture, a moment when the philosopher at court was forced to look at the cost of his influence. A mother had been murdered, and the boy he once tutored was now a sovereign unbound by conscience. Seneca withdrew further from the heart of imperial decision-making. He sought to limit his exposure, citing ill health and a desire for philosophical seclusion. Yet, as one of the emperor's key advisors, full retreat was impossible. Nero still relied on his counsel, still leaned on his reputation, still wore the illusion of stoic wisdom like a cloak to pacify the Senate and citizens. Seneca became increasingly weary, caught between public expectation and private disillusionment, performing a role he no longer believed in. Despite the inner conflict, Seneca's intellect remained sharp. This period saw the completion of some of his most enduring works, including dialogues and essays on anger, mercy, and the brevity of life. These texts did not overtly criticize the emperor, but instead offered meditations on human weakness, ethical living, and the transience of fortune. They read like coded reflections, philosophy sharpened by experience, filled with subtle warning and stoic resignation. Even as he guided others, Seneca was clearly speaking to himself. His relationship with Nero became increasingly strained. The emperor surrounded himself with flatterers, men who encouraged excess and scorned restraint. Seneca, a symbol of old virtue, was tolerated more than trusted. Rumors began to circulate that the philosopher was too powerful, too wealthy, and perhaps too revered. The court that had once welcomed his guidance now viewed him with suspicion. Influence, once his tool for doing good, had become a liability. Seneca recognized the shift. In a final bid for dignity, he requested permission to retire. He offered to return his wealth, to relinquish his holdings, to disappear quietly into philosophical retirement. Nero denied the request, insisting his presence was still necessary. Though it was clear the emperor now valued Seneca more as a symbol than as a man. Trapped in a golden cage, the philosopher remained, awaiting the right moment to disappear without drawing blood. The days grew darker, and Seneca knew the storm was no longer approaching. It had arrived. He was no longer a mentor, but a witness, forced to watch as his former students slid into tyranny. His teachings, his guidance, his hopes for a philosopher king had all been twisted into a grotesque theater of power. As Nero's reign entered its middle years, the tempo of imperial life accelerated into chaos, and Seneca, once the revered tutor and statesman, found himself increasingly marginalized. The philosopher had long understood the ephemeral nature of influence, yet the experience of watching it wither in real time was a bitter ordeal. The corridors he once walked with quiet authority now echoed with the footsteps of younger, more unscrupulous courtiers whose counsel to the emperor reflected indulgence, not wisdom. Seneca's presence in court had become more ceremonial than substantial. His opinions were sought out less frequently, and when offered, were met with thin smiles or carefully measured nods. Nero had outgrown his teacher, or rather, he had rejected the idea of being taught. Where once the emperor had leaned on his advisor's restraint, he now recoiled from it, perceiving it as judgment. The values that Seneca espoused, temperance, humility, reflection, were incompatible with the empire Nero was shaping, one built on spectacle, fear, and flattery. In this shifting climate, Seneca's moral compass became a quiet rebellion. He no longer shaped policy, but began, in subtle ways, to signal disapproval. He ceased attending public ceremonies unless required, limited his correspondence with those close to the emperor, and began to isolate himself from political entanglements. These actions, though cautious, were noticed. In an environment where silence could be interpreted as dissent, Seneca's withdrawal was a statement louder than words. The court's perception of Seneca began to shift from philosopher-statesman to latent adversary. His immense wealth, accumulated over years of public service and private inheritance, made him an object of envy and suspicion. Critics accused him of hypocrisy, preaching simplicity while living in comfort. Although Seneca had never denied the paradox of his position, he now struggled to justify it even to himself. He began to divest portions of his estate, funding public works and forgiving debts, efforts that, while ethically sincere, also served to shield him from political attack. In private, Seneca's reflections took on a more somber tone. His essays and letters from this period were increasingly preoccupied with the ideas of mortality, fate, and detachment. The stoicism he once taught now became his personal refuge. He emphasized the importance of being prepared to leave life at any moment, not in despair, but with dignity. "We are born into a brief space of time," he wrote, "and our duty is to pass through it as virtuously as we can." These were not abstract musings, but preparatory thoughts, his soul girding itself for what might come. Outside his estate, the empire was transforming into a crucible of paranoia. Nero's inner circle tightened. Executions of senators and nobles became more frequent, often justified by vague allegations of disloyalty. The Senate, once a stage for Seneca's eloquence, had become a theater of fear. Rome's aristocracy whispered plots, while others simply vanished. The philosopher knew too well that his continued survival depended less on loyalty and more on the emperor's caprice. Seneca's conscience became a battlefield. He had long straddled two identities, that of the idealist philosopher and the pragmatic advisor. Now, with his influence dissolved, only the philosopher remained. Yet even philosophy offered no escape from ethical torment. He questioned his past decisions, his silence during moments of imperial cruelty, his compromises made for the sake of influence. The clarity of youth had been replaced with the gray fog of experience. Still, he resolved not to betray his principles again, not through action nor inaction. In one final appeal to self-preservation and integrity, Seneca formally requested permission to retire from public life, citing his failing health and his longing to dedicate himself fully to study. Nero, perhaps sensing the advantage of having his former tutor removed from court without scandal, granted the request. Seneca retreated to one of his country villas, nestled in the Campanian countryside. There, surrounded by cypress trees and quietude, he turned inward, reading, writing, and meditating. It was not a complete severance from the world, but it was his last real attempt to step outside its cruelty. For a brief time, it seemed that withdrawal might offer safety. Seneca no longer attended Senate sessions, no longer offered advice, no longer posed a threat. But his name still carried weight, and that was enough to stir anxiety in the emperor's mind. In a regime where perception was as dangerous as fact, Seneca's mere existence became a silent accusation, a symbol of the moral authority Nero had long abandoned. The philosopher understood that peace was temporary, and that history had a way of catching up with those who tried to outrun their roles. He lived now with a quiet clarity, like a man walking beside a river he knew he would soon cross. There was no panic in him, only preparation. In the spring of 65 CE, Rome quivered beneath a veil of secrecy and suspicion. Beneath the gleaming facades of temples and palaces, whispers moved like smoke through senatorial halls and private gardens. The empire had become a place where words carried weight heavier than swords, and where even silence could be interpreted as sedition. It was in this tense atmosphere that the Pisonian conspiracy took form, a bold, if desperate, plot to end Nero's tyrannical rule. The conspiracy was named for Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a wealthy and charismatic noble with strong ties to both the aristocracy and military. Disillusioned by Nero's cruelty and excess, Piso and his circle sought to restore a version of Rome that respected its traditions and institutions. Their plan was straightforward in intent, though perilous in execution. Assassinate the emperor, install Piso as the new princeps, and purge the regime of corruption. It was a revolt of patrician conscience against imperial decay. The conspirators were not a ragtag collection of idealists. Among them were senators, equestrians, poets, soldiers, even members of the imperial household. It was a wide web of discontent, united not by ideology, but by exhaustion with Nero's reign. Some joined out of patriotic conviction, others out of opportunism or fear. But all understood the cost of failure. Under Nero, even the suspicion of betrayal invited death. Under his surveillance, plotting treason required both courage and calculation. Seneca, now living in semi-retirement, far from the courts of power, had no confirmed role in the conspiracy. Yet his name surfaced early in the investigation. To many Romans, Seneca remained a moral authority and a figure of symbolic opposition to Nero's debauchery. Though he had long since ceased to advise the emperor, his continued survival suggested a quiet, latent power, one that could legitimize a post-Nero regime. Piso's supporters likely hoped Seneca might be drawn in as a moral figurehead, or at least stay silent if the plot succeeded. But the plot never had the chance to unfold. It unraveled not through violence, but betrayal. A freedman, possibly seeking favor or fearing exposure, revealed the conspiracy to Nero. What followed was swift and brutal. Interrogations, forced confessions, executions. The imperial machinery moved with cold efficiency, and Nero, wounded by the knowledge that so many had turned against him, responded with even greater paranoia. When Seneca's name appeared among the alleged sympathizers, the emperor hesitated. The relationship between the two men had long decayed into formality, but there remained a shadow of memory, of tutelage, of loyalty, of political convenience. Still, Nero had changed. His decisions were no longer weighted by reflection, but driven by fear. Summoning a centurion, he issued an order that required neither trial nor explanation. Seneca must die. The philosopher was at his villa outside Rome when the soldiers arrived. The news, while grim, seemed to bring him an eerie calm. He had long anticipated this end. In his writings, he had prepared himself for it countless times. Now that the moment had arrived, he met it not with protest, but with poise. He asked only for time to compose himself, to speak with friends and family, and to prepare his body and mind for death. In the hours that followed, Seneca moved with solemn dignity. He embraced his wife, Paulina, and begged her to endure life rather than follow him into death. She refused, inspired, or perhaps broken. By love, she attempted to take her own life beside him. Accounts vary, but it is said that Nero's guards intervened to save her, fearing public outrage at her death. Seneca, meanwhile, opened his veins, the classical method of Roman suicide for condemned nobles. When the blood flowed too slowly, he drank poison, then entered a warm bath to hasten the end. His death, like his life, was theatrical and philosophical. Witnesses reported that he spoke calmly, offering reflections on the soul's freedom and the virtue of accepting fate. He did not curse Nero, nor plead for mercy. He died as he had always preached, with control, with thought, with dignity. In those final moments, the teacher became the lesson. His body failed, but his composure endured, a final testament to stoic resolve. News of his death reverberated throughout Rome. To Nero's court, it was the silencing of a dangerous relic. To the Senate and the people, it was the extinguishing of a rare light in a darkening empire. But Seneca's influence was not buried with his body. In the years following Seneca's death, his presence did not fade with the silence of his final breath. Instead, it lingered, resonating through his writings, preserved meticulously by friends and admirers who had once sat in the shadow of his wisdom. These texts, composed over a lifetime of philosophical introspection and political entanglement, became his true final testament. In them, the man emerged not as a martyr or a hero, but as a thinker deeply conscious of life's complexities, contradictions, and impermanence. Among his most enduring works were the Epistulae Moralis ad Lucilium, the moral letters to Lucilius. In these, Seneca wrote not with the tone of a man preaching from a mountaintop, but with the intimacy of a friend offering guidance. Each letter was a meditation, carefully crafted to address themes of mortality, time, virtue, anger, friendship, and the pursuit of inner peace. Though addressed to one man, they spoke to all who might find themselves lost in the noise of ambition or the confusion of the human condition. Seneca's style was deliberate and personal, marked by clarity and brevity. He avoided the ornate flourishes favored by other Roman authors. Instead, he favored sharp, aphoristic phrases that pierce straight to the heart. "Life is long, if you know how to use it," he declared. Or, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." These lines echoed through the centuries, distilled truths born from both contemplation and experience. His philosophical framework was rooted in Stoicism, yet it bore a distinctly Roman flavor, pragmatic, adaptive, and emotionally engaged. Seneca did not advocate for withdrawal from society, as some Greek Stoics had done, but for participation tempered by virtue. He believed that a man should live in accordance with nature and reason, but that he must also engage with his duties, accept hardship without complaint, and cultivate inner freedom regardless of external circumstances. Seneca's essays explore these ideas in broader scope. On Anger dissected the destructive nature of rage and offered methods for mastering it. On the Shortness of Life warned against squandering time on trivialities, reminding readers that life's brevity is not the issue, misuse of it is. On The Happy Life confronted the paradoxes of wealth and contentment, seeking balance between possession and detachment. These works were not abstractions. They were drawn from the lived tension of a man who had seen both the pinnacle of influence and the threat of a tyrant's sword. Yet perhaps what most defined Seneca's writing was its unwavering confrontation with death. To him, death was not a catastrophe, but the final frontier of philosophy, the moment when one's convictions must either prove true or dissolve under fear. He encouraged readers to contemplate death regularly, not morbidly, but as a reminder of life's urgency. "Let us prepare our minds as if we'd come to the very end," he wrote. "Let us postpone nothing." In this acceptance, he believed, lay ultimate freedom. What made Seneca's legacy unique was not only the content of his thought, but the context in which it was delivered. He was not an ivory tower philosopher, secluded from the burdens of public life. He had moved among emperors, negotiated law, advised on matters of war and peace. His insights were shaped by real conflicts, internal and external, making his writings feel immediate and human. Readers recognized not a perfect sage, but a man striving, failing, and striving again, a reflection of themselves. In the centuries after his death, Seneca's works circulated widely across the Roman world and beyond. Early Christian thinkers, despite doctrinal differences, found resonance in his ethical teachings and moral clarity. During the Renaissance, his texts were revived with fervor by scholars who saw in him a bridge between antiquity and the modern moral sensibility. Writers like Montaigne, Erasmus, and later Emerson drew upon his words for inspiration. His influence seeped into the literary and philosophical bedrock of the Western tradition. Still, interpretations of Seneca remained divided. Some viewed him as a compromised idealist, one who failed to live fully by the Stoic code he espoused. Others saw in that very contradiction a source of strength, a man who wrestled openly with the problem of how to be good in a world that often rewards the opposite. His self-awareness, far from undermining his credibility, gave his philosophy its enduring emotional texture. Long after Seneca's death, his ideas continued to ripple through time like waves stirred by a distant storm. His legacy, shaped by words rather than monuments, refused to fade into the dust of empire. What began as a series of meditations and letters in ancient Rome transcended the boundaries of language, geography, and belief systems, embedding itself in the intellectual frameworks of vastly different eras. Seneca's influence became not only a matter of philosophical admiration, but a lens through which successive generations examined their own moral landscapes. In the early centuries of the Christian era, Seneca's writings found surprising resonance among Christian thinkers. Despite being a Stoic and a pagan, his moral teachings on humility, patience, charity, and a contempt for worldly pleasures mirrored values found in emerging Christian doctrine. Church fathers like Tertullian and Lactantius quoted him with reverence, even as they debated the theological gaps between Stoicism and Christianity. A legendary correspondence between Seneca and St. Paul, though almost certainly apocryphal, emerged in later centuries as a symbol of philosophical harmony between ancient virtue and Christian ethics. During the medieval period, Seneca's visibility waned but never disappeared. Monasteries preserved his works alongside sacred texts, recognizing in them a guide to ethical self-examination. While theological priorities overshadowed philosophical inquiry in that age, his writings continued to be copied, annotated, and occasionally preached. For monks in cloistered solitude, the Stoics' call to inner discipline and contemplation provided a secular echo of spiritual devotion. The Renaissance, however, marked the true revival of Seneca's stature. Humanist scholars, enchanted by classical antiquity, rediscovered his texts with fervor. To them, Seneca was more than a philosopher. He was a bridge between the ancient world and the new spirit of inquiry. Figures such as Petrarch and Erasmus studied him not just for his wisdom, but for his elegant Latin prose. His works became tools of education, shaping the moral compass of students, statesmen, and poets alike. Montaigne, the French essayist who helped define modern introspective writing, found in Seneca a kindred soul. He cited Seneca frequently, drawing from his reflections on mortality and human frailty. The Stoics' practice of turning inward to examine one's conscience resonated with Montaigne's own efforts to understand the self. This relationship between the two thinkers, separated by over a millennium, demonstrated the enduring intimacy of Seneca's words. They spoke not only to his time, but to the eternal struggles of the human spirit. In England, Seneca's plays, especially his dark and violent tragedies, influenced the development of Elizabethan drama. Writers such as Thomas Kyd and even William Shakespeare drew inspiration from Seneca's theatrical works, which explored themes of revenge, madness, and moral corruption. His tragedies, though less celebrated than his prose, introduced a psychological depth and philosophical introspection to the stage that would define Western drama for centuries. By the Enlightenment, Seneca's moral clarity appealed to thinkers advocating for reason, virtue, and self-determination. Rousseau and Voltaire admired his ethical fortitude, while Diderot integrated his Stoicism into the secular philosophies underpinning the French Revolution. His emphasis on personal integrity, inner freedom, and duty to the public good provided a moral foundation in an age that sought to liberate humanity from superstition and tyranny. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Seneca's reputation experienced a nuanced reappraisal. Some criticized the dissonance between his wealth and his teachings, viewing him as a figure torn between privilege and principle. Yet others saw in this tension a familiar struggle, the challenge of upholding moral ideals while navigating flawed systems. Writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson and George Eliot referenced him as a guide to moral resilience in times of rapid change and uncertainty. In the modern era, Seneca's influence has found renewed vigor in the rising interest in practical philosophy and mindfulness. The global resurgence of Stoicism, particularly among entrepreneurs, soldiers, psychologists, and readers seeking clarity in a chaotic world, has placed Seneca at the forefront once again. His letters and essays are quoted in podcasts, leadership seminars, and self-help literature. For a digital generation overwhelmed by distraction and pressure, his call to simplicity and presence feels more urgent than ever. Thus, Seneca's reach spans centuries not because he answered every question, but because he asked the right ones. How should one live? How can we endure suffering? What does it mean to be free? These inquiries, cast into the flow of history, continue to find new voices and interpretations. Seneca's life was a tapestry woven with contradictions. A Stoic who amassed great wealth, a moralist entangled in political intrigue, a philosopher whose name became linked not only to wisdom, but also to compromise. These tensions do not diminish his legacy, they define it. For within the contradictions lies the most human aspect of Seneca, his persistent striving to reconcile philosophy with life, virtue with duty, and thought with action. He was not a sage above the fray, but a man immersed in the very struggles he sought to understand. His rise to power, particularly as tutor and advisor to Nero, placed him in the heart of Roman political machinery. There, theory and practice collided. His teachings on temperance and self-control stood in uneasy contrast with the cruelty and extravagance of the imperial court. To his critics, this was hypocrisy. To others, it was the difficult reality of a man trying to steer an empire away from tyranny while preserving a fragile moral compass. His role became one of constant negotiation, walking the line between influence and integrity. What makes Seneca a figure of lasting fascination is his awareness of these tensions. He did not pretend to be flawless, nor did he conceal his inner conflict. In his writings, particularly in the candid passages of his letters, he admits to struggling with attachment to comfort, fear of death, and the temptations of luxury. These admissions transform him from a remote moral authority into a companion in the reader's own moral journey. A voice that neither condemns nor excuses, but empathizes. This paradox, preacher and practitioner, insider and dissident, philosopher and courtier, has invited generations of debate. Was Seneca a failed Stoic or the ultimate Stoic, who tested his philosophy not in the quiet of contemplation, but in the roaring storm of imperial politics? The answer may be both. His life was not a clean embodiment of Stoic perfection, but a battlefield where ideals were tested under pressure. In this way, he served as an exemplar not of Stoic attainment, but of Stoic striving. His wealth, often scrutinized by ancient and modern commentators alike, serves as a symbol of the contradiction he bore. Accumulating fortunes through estate holdings and imperial patronage, Seneca simultaneously urged readers to live with simplicity and disdain the fleeting nature of material wealth. Yet he did not renounce his possessions. Instead, he wrote of them with critical detachment, recognizing their presence while attempting to master their hold over him. Whether this was self-deception or moral lucidity remains a question that adds depth to his character. Seneca's political writings also reveal a mind aware of Rome's fragility. His essays on clemency, especially those addressed to Nero, are not abstract discourses but carefully crafted appeals to conscience and statecraft. In them, Seneca defines mercy as a virtue not of weakness, but of power used wisely. These texts read as both political instruction and personal plea, words that might save lives if heard, or stand as testimony if ignored. That Nero ultimately spurned this guidance underscores the tragedy at the heart of Seneca's public life. Even in his death, the paradox persisted. Ordered to commit suicide by the very emperor he once tutored, Seneca met his fate with calm resolution. To some, this was proof of his moral courage. To others, it symbolized the ultimate cost of proximity to power. Yet in the performance of his death, measured, composed, deliberate, he embodied the Stoic principle of accepting what one cannot change with dignity. It was a theatrical, yet deeply philosophical end. Beyond Rome, Seneca's paradox became a model for countless figures navigating the complexities of public life. Statesmen, reformers, and philosophers alike have cited his example, some to justify engagement with corrupt systems, others to caution against moral compromise. His life remains a canvas on which others project their own struggles with integrity in the face of institutional power. What ultimately sustains Seneca's relevance is not the image of a man who had all the answers, but of one who relentlessly questioned himself. His writings pulse with the urgency of a mind that knew how easy it was to stray from principle and how hard it was to return. His self-reflection, more than any doctrinal purity, is what invites trust. Seneca never demanded perfection from his readers, only vigilance, humility, and courage. In the end, the paradox of Seneca is not a flaw, but a mirror. In it, we see the difficulty of living a life of virtue in a world full of compromise. His legacy is not that of a saint, but of a philosopher who refused to turn away from life's messiness. Through his struggles, he reminds us that wisdom is not a destination, but a discipline, a practice that continues, even as the world shifts around us. And in this, Seneca the Younger, flawed and fearless, remains not just a Roman thinker, but a timeless guide.